Hi, everyone. Good to see you all again. We've described the action evaluation process that we'd be using, including the ASAP tool, in some other sessions with all of you, but I'm going to give a recap on that process and then provide a bit more detail from how it worked when we applied it in Davis. Next slide, please. So you've seen this slide before in one of our prior presentations. These are the high-level steps for the action development process. We received a ton of really great input, as Carrie mentioned, and initial ideas from the workshops, surveys, and directly from city staff. And we organized all of those comments, probably over 1,000 comments at this point, into topical categories so that we could start to make sense of it all and identify themes and potential gaps related to the proposed climate goals. So this process included combining similar comments into one draft action, as well as filtering out comments that were not proposing a specific action, were not topically related to the CAAP framework, or that were more detailed than an action. So there were many ideas that can be turned into specific implementation steps in the next phase of the project. So for that purpose, we already have a good library of those ideas to draw from. From all of these actions, we organized them into a list of about 100 potential draft actions that we wanted to evaluate further in ASAP based on the co-benefits, feasibility, and other criteria that we discussed when we introduced that tool. As part of that action development process, the city team also met, as Carrie mentioned, internally with city staff to collect additional action ideas after workshops 2 and 3, and then provided the initial draft list of 100 actions for review to identify any fatal flaws or major gaps in that list. To complete these evaluations, we met with the city team 3 times, including with Ash Feeney at several meetings, to evaluate the co-benefits and feasibility aspect of all of those 100 proposed actions. So now we get to the red highlighted part of this flowchart. We met with city staff in 2 meetings to review the evaluation results and select the draft prioritized list of actions that we're going to discuss later today. And again, Ash joined us for that second prioritization meeting to weigh in on the selection process. We will then confirm that draft list of priorities at our final public workshop in October. And then the final step here is then to flesh out in more detail the prioritized actions to provide an implementation roadmap that the city can follow after plan adoption next year. Next slide, please. So again, as I previously described, the process we used considered 3 lenses for action evaluation. There's the primary benefits, that's the greenhouse gas and climate risk reductions. There's the co-benefits, and there's feasibility. The co-benefits, or the additional benefits as we framed them in survey number 1, are those beneficial impacts actions can provide beyond the primary benefits that are the main purpose of the CAAP. And then feasibility, again, is just describing how easy or hard an action would be to implement. So the action prioritization process then attempts to balance these multiple assessments, the primary benefits, the co-benefits, and the feasibility, to define a short list of priorities. An action with high greenhouse gas reduction potential can also result in negative co-benefit impacts or have very low feasibility. And maybe that's a reason that you would decide not to prioritize it in the plan. Alternatively, you can see actions that have very low greenhouse gas reduction potential, but they provide significant other co-benefits that are important to the community, and or they might have a high feasibility rating. And that could be the rationale for why it is ultimately prioritized. Next slide, please. So within this framework of co-benefits and feasibility criteria, we identified 3 co-benefit criteria that were informed by community inputs, and then 3 feasibility criteria. And again, those co-benefit criteria that we used include air quality and public health, environmental stewardship, and racial equity and social justice. And then the feasibility criteria that were selected are city authority, public supports, and additional capital required to implement. Next slide. And then within ASAP, we qualitatively evaluated each action against all of those criteria. The co-benefit criteria followed the rating scale that's shown here, where we scored actions as very positive, somewhat positive, neutral, somewhat negative, or very negative. The generic rating definitions for all of the co-benefits are shown here, but we also defined a scoring rubric that had specific language for the selected criteria so that we could evaluate actions consistently. And the purpose in in setting those definitions was so that during the action evaluation meetings, we knew when to pick very positive versus positive consistently, for example. And part of creating consistency, as part of creating that consistency for action evaluations, we established some rating rules to guide us. So for example, for the equity and inclusion co-benefit, we only assigned very positive ratings to actions that were specifically targeted at vulnerable populations, such as incentive programs with provisions for vulnerable populations. Actions that had an indirect positive impact on equity and inclusion, things like increasing public transit service and accessibility, received a somewhat positive rating. Excuse me. And then similarly for the air quality and public health co-benefit, we decided that for our purposes, a very positive rating would apply to those actions that had wide-reaching community impacts, like expanding active mobility infrastructure across the city, while a somewhat positive rating would apply to actions that had smaller or more indirect impacts, like incentivizing EV charger installations. And this process ensures that actions were evaluated consistently within the framework so that the results can reasonably be compared when determining those priorities. If a different group were to evaluate the same actions, they might come up with and use a slightly different set of rules for action evaluation. But as long as they also apply those rules consistently, then they also would be creating a replicable process by which to evaluate actions and determine priorities. So the process is really more about taking a methodological approach to evaluating these widely disparate action types and then documenting the decision-making process than it is in attempting to calculate the most perfect list of actions. Next slide, please. And then for feasibility criteria, by their nature, the feasibility criteria rating scales were all customized to each of those individual criteria. So in the table here, for city authority, for example, the rating scale considers how easy or hard is it to implement an action. Maybe an action is included under an existing policy, or it could be included if a new policy is adopted. Maybe the action is outside of the city's authority because it rests with the state or the federal government. As with the co-benefits, we again established feasibility rating rules to provide consistency. For example, with city authority, if the city needs to partner with a separate entity to achieve an action, then we rated it as joint authority, and therefore it was given a relatively lower score. If the city could achieve the action by itself, it was rated as within the city's authority and either under existing policy or requiring a new policy, and both of those would have received a relatively higher score. Additional capital can also be a little bit squishy when considering potential implementation costs. So for our purposes, if an action only required existing staff time to achieve it, and we felt there was enough capacity that hiring new staff wasn't needed, then we rated that action as a very low cost, the $0 to $59,000 bucket. If an outside consultant would be needed to implement that action or achieve that action, in general, we rated those at some cost, so $60,000 to just under $500,000. And that, again, was depending a little bit on the type of project that consultant might need to develop. Actions that required purchasing significant amounts of equipment or developing infrastructure typically fell into the large and very large cost categories. I'll note that costing was not intended to be exact, but it's helpful to have a general sense of cost when considering an action's feasibility. So for example, from a cost perspective, the city could probably handle developing an outreach campaign to improve organic waste diversion, and could probably do that without seeking outside funding. But something like elevating critical roads and or relocating critical infrastructure outside of the flood zones is orders of magnitude more expensive and therefore likely more challenging to implement. Next slide. So that was the framework for the action evaluation. After we implemented that evaluation process that I just described, we facilitated 2 meetings with the city team to review the results and define a set of 25 actions to be prioritized for immediate implementation in the CAAP. And the final prioritized actions will be more fully developed within the CAAP to include things like including through the definition of implementation roadmaps that will be used to set the course for early action following plan adoption. We're going to discuss the implementation roadmaps in greater detail at our next and final TAC meeting. I think it's important to note also here, before we move on, what happens to those other evaluated but non-prioritized actions. So there's about 75 or so of those. Those actions don't disappear. They just don't receive as much attention or treatment in the plan. That initial list of 100 actions was full of really great ideas to reduce emissions, address climate risks, and provide meaningful co-benefits and or address community equity issues. The purpose of prioritizing is simply to acknowledge that the city doesn't have unlimited funds or staff resources to implement everything all at once. So the priorities are those actions that they will implement and pursue first, but the non-prioritized actions would still be included in the CAAP and perhaps even sorted further into buckets for medium and longer term implementation, so that there's a bit of a next step or phasing hierarchy already considered. And a lot can happen between now and the plan's first 2030 target year. So subsequent CAAP monitoring and plan updates will be helpful in moving new actions into that priorities list. And new priority selection can then start from that library of other actions that will already be included within the CAAP. And then one final note on action representation in the plan. While reviewing the 1,000 plus comments for ideas for actions, we saw numerous draft action ideas for topics on which the city should play an advocacy role. And we decided to set those aside. We did not evaluate them within the ASAP framework, but are proposing that those actions would be listed in a subsection of the CAAP, because there are a lot of really great ideas calling out specific places where the city could take a leadership role and really advocate for changes at the state or federal level. Next slide, and I'm going to try to hydrate myself better. Okay. The ASAP tool does not tell you your priorities. It doesn't even give you a combined score for each action. It instead gives you scores for each of the action evaluation areas: greenhouse gas reduction, risk reduction, co-benefits, and feasibility. And that was a conscious decision when designing the tool to help preserve the nuance within each of those evaluation areas. What that means, though, is that the users then need to interpret the results following the evaluation process to define their set of priorities and make sure that those priorities are right for you. So 100 users looking at the same completed ASAP tool for Davis could potentially define 100 different lists of priorities. The importance, again, is in documenting how you interpreted the results to make your determination. And that then gives you a basis for confirming that selection with stakeholders. So this slide documents the approach the city took in defining the 25 draft priorities. Again, the intent was moving from, I think this is a more precise number, moving from 111 actions that got evaluated in ASAP to a shorter list of those 25 priorities for immediate implementation, or immediate starts to implementation, since some of the draft priorities will take longer timeframes to complete. The AECOM team proposed an initial approach during the prioritization meetings, and then the city team refined that iteratively until we got to the draft list that we're going to present. As the plan will be a climate action and adaptation plan, we started with a discussion on what the approximate distribution of goal should be for greenhouse gas actions versus adaptation actions. And we ultimately decided we would aim for about 15 greenhouse gas actions and then 10 adaptation actions. So to do that, we looked at these different filters that are listed numerically here. We first looked at the top scoring actions for greenhouse gas reductions, and we picked the top 10 of those for starters. And then similarly, for top climate risk reduction, we pulled out the top 6 climate risk actions initially. And we put those into a bit of a running draft priority list that was then modified through each subsequent filter that's listed here in order. So next, we created a proxy total score. We looked at all of the action evaluation areas to understand which of those actions had the highest scores in each category. And we called those crosswalk actions. And we added the top, I think it was 4 or 5 of those, into this running list for further refinements. We then focused zeroing in on the co-benefit scores, and particularly high-performing actions for equity and inclusion. In each step here, we were comparing the top scorers within that new filter group against this running list of draft priorities, and we wanted to make sure that we weren't missing any of those top actions within the new filters. Steps 5 and 6 here then became a bit of a refinement to the initial greenhouse gas actions in particular. Almost all of the top scoring greenhouse gas actions were transportation actions. And that makes sense given the outsized contribution of that sector to the city's greenhouse gas inventory. However, the city team believes that a comprehensive approach to climate action is probably better in terms of prioritization. So we defined top scoring actions in the other greenhouse gas categories as well, things like buildings and energy, waste, and carbon removal. At this point, any new addition to the running list of priorities meant that we had to bump something out of the list. We had to remove something from that list originally. And we achieved this by removing some of the top scoring greenhouse gas actions from the bottom up to provide space within the list for these additional topics. And finally, we reviewed the transportation actions specifically to make sure that it wasn't overly weighted toward one topic or another, such as alternative fuel vehicles. We wanted to see top scoring transportation actions from a range of strategy types, things like mode shift, alternative transportation, land use change, and TDM strategies. Next slide. Let's see how I'm doing at time. Okay. This slide just illustrates a few of the outputs from ASAP on the left, and then some figures that we used comparatively on the right when we were trying to understand the holistic set of actions we prepared. So in that top left figure, it just illustrates one of the outputs from ASAP that shows the top 30 actions by risk reduction score. And the bottom left figure there, similarly, is the top 30 actions by co-benefit score. The top right figure is the distribution of the draft prioritized actions among different emissions categories, including stationary energy on the left, and then transportation, and then waste. So you can see that it shows that the priorities span those 3 categories, but there's greater emphasis on transportation and stationary energy actions and less so on waste. And again, that's consistent with the city's emissions distribution by sector as well. And that bottom right figure then shows draft prioritized actions by the climate hazard addressed. So from left to right, it includes extreme heat, the number of actions that address extreme heat, wildfires and air quality, droughts, and precipitation and flooding. Next slide. So now we're going to introduce the 25 actions. From that framework, we defined this list of the draft 25 prioritized actions. And I'm going to introduce each of them one by one so everyone can hear the full list aloud. And I will note that the order in which they're presented here doesn't reflect in any way their relative importance. We've grouped them topically just for clarity and organizational purposes. And that's how we're going to discuss them next in the group exercise. So this slide here has the first batch, and the first batch of prioritized actions, and they all have to be transportation actions. So we have revisit the most recent parking pricing study and adjust public parking pricing to disincentivize internal combustion vehicles. Transition the municipal vehicle fleet to alternative fuels, things like electric, battery electric, or hydrogen, including Davis Community Transit vehicles, but excluding exempt vehicles determined by the city manager, things like fire engines or other emergency or specialty vehicles.
Josh, this is Diana. Sorry to interrupt you. I'm just wondering, should we kind of pause after each action just to let people ask clarifying questions if they're not understanding what the action is, or did you want to wait and do that at the very end and come back?
We could do that I think maybe we should do that in the exercise, because we're going to look at these actions in groups of 5 or 6 and spend a little time discussing them further.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so number 3 was establish a congestion pricing or local roadway pricing program to disincentivize travel by internal combustion engine vehicles. Utilize more roadway capacity in Davis to provide additional space for transit and non-automotive travel options. Install level 2 and or 3 EV charging spaces in all public parking lots. Develop financing and incentives for purchasing or using bicycles, electric bikes, or scooters, and include specific provisions for vulnerable populations. Develop, fund, and staff a transportation demand management program to require employers to implement TDM strategies like van pool, rideshare, subsidized transit, parking pricing, employee parking cash out, etc. And then develop an electric bike and or scooter rental program with public charging areas and corrals at transit centers, as well as a pedicab service program. Next slide, please. So this next set has a wider range of topics, as you can see in that right-hand column. So here we have subsidized public transit, so it is free for all to use. Develop Davis public charging infrastructure plan to determine charging infrastructure needed to enable all people to go electric. Develop incentive options to increase housing construction in the city, including high-density, mixed-use, transit-oriented, and affordable options. Adopt requirements for electrification of building systems at end of useful life. Require energy efficiency upgrades at time of sale or lease for residential and commercial properties. Adopt a REACH code to require all electric new construction and alterations, including new city buildings. So that's issue no new permits for natural gas hookups. Increase enforcement of commercial food waste separation. Develop a technical advisory committee to research the carbon sequestration and carbon removal opportunities the city can pursue to balance its remaining emissions by 2040. And then implement recommendations in existing plans, such as the 2020 Urban Water Management Plan and 2018 Stormwater Operations Assessment Reports, and inventory and evaluate stormwater assets. Next slide. This is the last one, last of the draft prioritized actions. They are all adaptation actions. So relocate or elevate critical infrastructure out of projected flood areas. Develop policies to increase the use of green stormwater infrastructure and enhance natural water infiltration in public infrastructure. Modify the rental license program to include minimum energy efficiency and cooling and ventilation requirements. Develop policies that require air filtration and air conditioning in new construction while prioritizing rental properties. Develop an ordinance to require the use of cool surfaces, reflective materials, and coatings to reduce the heat island effect. Expand the urban forest with climate-ready trees that provide shade and develop a tree replacement plan for street trees for all neighborhoods. Develop financing and incentive options for low-flow fixtures and appliances and include specific provisions for vulnerable populations. And then finally, develop financing and incentive options to promote rainwater capture and harvesting, and again, include specific provisions for vulnerable populations.